Chapter 13. So, tell me all about the gala last night, Genevieve said as she lounged across Ava's bed. Ava bit back a smile and ducked into her closet to grab the outfit she planned to wear tonight. She had been dying to tell Genevieve about it, but it had been too late when she'd made it back the night before. It was nice. Tia Sweetchild was there. Ugh, I can't stand her. Ava popped back out and held up the outfit to get Jen's approval. Me either, but Justin totally put her in her place when she tried to rub it in that I didn't have a date last year. He amazed me. Genevieve looked over the outfit, tilted her head, and narrowed her eyes at Ava. Yeah, that's perfect. Amazed you, huh? And how about the rest of the night? It was fine. They served delicious food. I won the Emerging Author Award while Tia won nothing, so I consider that a win. We had several reporters approach us and take pictures, which should be good for both of our images. Ava slipped out of her flannel pants and shirt and into the skirt and shirt she had brought out. Why do I feel like there's a butt coming? Jen asked as she stretched out on the bed. Well, there was this weird moment where Tia cut in on us dancing. And Justin said she told him she knew the relationship was fake. He doesn't think it's anything to worry about, but he doesn't know Tia like I do. He's probably right. Tia won't come to our office, and even if she did, you know I won't say anything. More than likely, she was just fishing for information. Maybe, but it still makes me nervous. What if it gets discovered? Won't that ruin my reputation as a writer? Ava smoothed her skirt and regarded her reflection in the mirror. You worry too much. Even if it got discovered, it would be a flash-in-the-pan story. People would forget about it quickly and move on. Your writing would be fine. Now, how about anything else? Like more practice on the kiss? Jen wiggled her eyebrows suggestively. Ava felt the heat sear across her face and she averted her eyes. This is a fake relationship, remember? But the expression on Justin's face as he dropped her off flashed into her mind. She could have sworn there had been desire and struggle there, as if he'd wanted to kiss her, and she'd wanted him to. At least, she thought she had. Yeah, I remember. The question is, do you and Justin remember? I watched his face when he couldn't take his eyes off you last night. Like you were an ice-cold beer after a marathon. What? Who drinks beer after a marathon? Jen shrugged. You know what I mean. And then he pulls this knight in shining armor routine. That doesn't sound like the man who hates romance you described. Genevieve crossed to the vanity and patted the seat for Ava to sit. I didn't say he was a knight in shining armor. It's not like he rescued me from a dragon, although describing Tia as a dragon isn't far off. She sat down and faced the mirror. Besides, it's part of the game. He's pretending to care. Nothing more. Her eyes flicked to the mirror, daring Jen to disagree. But Jen said nothing as she picked up the curling iron and began curling her hair. The silence forced Ava to ponder Jen's words. Justin had seemed different last night. But surely it had been her imagination. He had made it very clear he held no interest in a real romance, and one night wouldn't change that. Would it? She watched as Jen created cascading curls in her hair. It created an effect so different from her usual look. It wasn't that Ava couldn't curl her own hair. She simply rarely did. Maybe it was because she thought her time was better spent writing, and maybe it was because she didn't want a man to fall in love with a perfect image, only to find out she wore sweatpants and a ponytail around the house most days. She'd had a friend tell her stories of how she woke up at 5 a.m. to put on makeup because she was terrified her husband would leave if he knew what she looked like without it. Ava didn't want a relationship like that. Better for him to see her flaws from the beginning. The doorbell rang, jolting her mind back to the present. That's Justin. Do I look okay? Genevieve flashed a knowing smile. Yep, good luck. Don't do anything stupid on national TV. Thanks for the boost of confidence. Ava stuck out her tongue at her friend before opening the door. Don't forget to lock up when you leave, she hollered over her shoulder. Did I interrupt something? Justin asked, looking over her shoulder. No, just Jen, being Jen. She pulled the door shut behind her and followed Justin to his car. So, this is my first television interview. Is there anything I should know? Yes, avoid the water. Trust me, the last thing you want to do is fight a full bladder on TV. Ava chuckled as she pictured him squirming in his seat. I take it you speak from experience. He shot her a pointed stare as he opened the door. It's not funny. The first time I appeared on a show, I was so nervous that I downed an entire bottle of water while I waited in the green room, which had no bathroom. I thought it would be fine because I was supposed to go on 20 minutes later, but the guest in front of me had a seizure, and they had to call an ambulance. Nearly an hour passed before they got her taken care of and came to get me. That left no time to use the bathroom as they were already behind in their filming. Needless to say, nerves combined with a full bladder do not make for a comfortable experience. It was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I wish I could have seen that. Ava couldn't help the smile that parted her lips as she slid into the seat. Justin rolled his eyes as he shut her door and walked around to his, but she had caught the ghost of a smile on his mouth. The ride to the studio remained quiet, but not uncomfortable. Ava found it odd how they could sit in silence, especially accounting for the fact they were still practically strangers, though he didn't feel much like a stranger anymore. She followed his lead when they pulled into the parking lot, and a surge of relief flooded her as he took her hand. Ava had no idea if that was part of the act, but gratitude filled her with the gesture. He stopped outside the front door and turned to her. Try not to be too nervous, he said, squeezing her hand. Remember, they smell fear. Ava nodded and took a deep breath as he opened the door. A smart brunette manned the desk in the lobby and looked up at them as they entered. Hi, Justin Miller and Ava McDermott. We have an interview with Kevin Jones. The brunette tapped a few keys on her computer. Yes, sir. I'll call Vicky to come get you. It should be just a few minutes. Vicky, a young woman with a headset glued to her ears and a clipboard attached to her hands, showed up a few minutes later. She led them down the hallway to a small dressing room with a large mirror and 2 chairs. Desi will be in shortly to check your makeup. Is she always so brusque? Ava asked as she perched in one of the chairs. Justin shrugged. I don't recognize her from the last time I appeared, but it's not usually long from here. After they check makeup, they'll probably move us to the green room, which leads to the stage when it's time. A minute later, another woman appeared. Her blonde hair was pulled into side pigtails, but her clothes made the look appear hip instead of childish. I'm Desi, and I'm here to make you beautiful. I know you think you are already, but believe me, I work magic. What you've done doesn't always look good on HD, so please don't be offended if I change something. The smacking of her gum exaggerated the bored timbre of her voice, and Ava wondered how many times a day she gave the same spiel. Desi motioned for Justin to sit first. She tilted his chin up and then side to side. You must be in the industry, she said as she opened a container with powder. She dusted some across his forehead and the bridge of his nose and then stepped back. I'm a host for a dating show, and I've been doing my own makeup for TV for years. Justin's chest puffed out a little in pride, and Ava mashed her lips together to keep from laughing. Only a TV personality would brag about his ability to put on makeup. I've been doing mine for years, too, she said, smiling up at Desi as she sat in the chair Justin had vacated. Since the age of 12, anyway. Desi tilted her head up and frowned. Yeah? Well, there's a difference between doing your makeup and doing it for HD TV. She shook her head. This eye color won't work. Ava's smile faltered as Desi wiped a cool cotton ball across her lids. She couldn't believe she had to get her makeup redone, while Justin's had been nearly perfect. He caught her eye and winked before dusting his shoulders as if congratulating himself. She stuck her tongue out at him. He could have at least warned her, so she hadn't opened her mouth like a complete fool. She'd had no idea doing your makeup for television was very different from everyday makeup. He grinned and stuck his tongue out at her in return, and Ava felt something in their relationship shift. When Ava's makeup met Desi's satisfaction, she led them out of the room and to another area that Ava assumed must be the green room. Vicky, or headset girl as Ava had taken to calling her in her head, watched a screen that showed a live view of the stage. There were a few more chairs and no mirror in this room, but otherwise it appeared no different. Justin sat in one of the chairs, but Ava paced in a small circle. She tugged on her shirt, wishing suddenly that she had worn something different. This one felt too tight all of a sudden. She glanced over at Justin, but he still appeared calm and collected. How could he not be nervous? There was no planning live television, and Justin liked to have everything planned out. Sure, Kevin Jones, the host, had given them questions he might ask, but Ava had heard stories about hosts deviating from those questions, sometimes for whatever reason. "Will you stop?" he asked as she tugged on her shirt again. "You're making me nervous, and I'm never nervous in front of the camera." "Why shouldn't I be nervous?" she asked. "What if he asks us something we didn't practice?" "Shh," he hissed in a low voice as he looked around. He crossed to her and placed his hands on her arms. Then he leaned down until his face was inches from hers. "We don't talk like that, ever, and especially not here. Look, I know this is new for you, but Kevin is generally a straight shooter. If it wasn't on the card, he probably won't ask it." Ava swallowed as the nearness of him washed over her. His blue eyes stared into hers and her breath caught. "Okay," she whispered breathlessly, "but you take the lead. You answer first, and I'll chime in only if asked or add little details." Her lips parted before she could stop them, and his gaze dropped to them before returning to her eyes. She could almost read the question of permission in his gaze, and she closed her eyes in assent. "You guys are on in 5, Headset Girl said from the side of the stage, and the moment shattered. Justin jumped away from her and reached for his tie. Ava cleared her throat as she fought to bring her heartbeat back under control. "Can I get some water?" Suddenly, her throat was as dry as the Sahara Desert. Headset Girl rolled her eyes, but a moment later a boy appeared with a water bottle in hand. Ava had just managed a sip when Headset Girl motioned them over. "You're on." Ava looked around for a place to put the water, but nothing was nearby, and Headset Girl was ushering her out. Oh well, bringing a water bottle out wasn't that big of a deal, right? The sound of the applause hit her first, and Ava froze as she scanned the room. It wasn't a large room, but it was packed. There were 3 sections with at least 10 rows of 10 chairs, and a person filled each and every seat. She tried to do the math in her head. Was that 300 people? "Are you going to join us, Ava?" Ava looked to her left, where Justin and Kevin were standing and staring her direction. "Oh, right. Yes, sorry." She hurried to join them, her face hot, but as she did, her foot caught on something and she flew forward. Justin reached to catch her, but her momentum carried her past his arms and into his chest. The water bottle squished between them, the force of their bodies popping the lid and sending water shooting into the air. Ava jumped back in surprise, but the damage was done. Water drenched her front, sending her shirt clinging to her. But Justin's predicament was even worse. The water had landed on the crotch of his pants in a most unfortunate place. A collective gasp erupted from the audience, and Ava's hand flew to her mouth. "I am so sorry." Justin's gaze was unreadable as he wiped at his pants. "Well, this is quite the way to make an entrance." Kevin took control of the situation, but he couldn't contain his smile either. "Ladies and gentlemen, Justin Miller and Ava McDermott. Why don't you guys have a seat and I'll have towels brought out?" The crowd laughed and cheered as Headset Girl ran out with 2 towels. Justin and Ava each took one and sat. As discreetly as possible, Ava patted her shirt, hoping her pink bra wasn't showing underneath. She should have listened to Jen and wore the beige one, but she had claimed it was too boring. Well, it would definitely not be boring if her pink one was showing. At least Justin could hide his wet pants when seated. He folded the towel on his lap. "So, Justin, you've been hosting Who Wants to Marry a Cowboy for 10 years, is that right?" "That's right, Kevin. 10 years and going strong." Justin flashed his fake smile. He was way too good at that, and Ava wondered if she had even seen his real smile. 10 years is a long time to watch people fall in love, especially when your life hasn't reflected that. Justin's jaw tightened beside her, and Ava tried to contain her shock. This had not been on the list of questions, and it felt like Kevin hoped to anger Justin. She hoped he would keep his cool and answer the question because she certainly couldn't. His past relationships were an area Justin had refused to fill her in on. She knew his wife had died, but that had been as much as he'd shared. "I've had my fair share of bumps, but everyone has. Still," he picked up Ava's hand and his smile stretched further, "love always wins in the end." Ava forced a smile in return. He looked pained, not happy, rather like the Joker from Batman. "Yes, and we'll get to that in a second. But since you've been on the show, you've been married twice. Is that right?" Justin's grip tightened on Ava's hand. "Yes, that's right. My first wife passed away, and a few years later I met my second wife. And she left you for her Botox doctor. Is that right?" The tension in the room lay heavy, tangible. Ava should say something, but what? "She did." Veins bulged in Justin's throat, and the muscles in his jaw tensed. Ava wasn't sure how much longer he would keep his cool. "Her loss, though." Ava's eyes widened when she realized she had said the words out loud and not in her head. "I mean, if she hadn't, then I never would have met Justin." Justin's eyes sent her a silent thank you as he squeezed her hand again. Kevin's eyes, however, roamed over her face as if searching for any sign of weakness. "You're a romance writer, isn't that right, Ava?" She beamed, first at Justin and then at the audience. "I am. Love is important for what I do, and I think it's important for everyone to have in their life. Yet you remained single up until recently as well, right?" Kevin's words felt like an accusation, but Ava was determined to keep a calm demeanor. "That I was. I don't believe in falling in love with every man I date because I am looking for something more serious." Kevin's eyebrow lifted and he sat back. "And you found it with Justin, the man who claimed love was a fraud and relationships never last?" Disbelief was written all over Kevin's face. Ava smiled at Justin. "I think we've all thought that at one time or another. Sometimes when life throws you lemons, you get soured for a time before you realize you can use them to make lemonade." "That is an interesting concept, and you certainly seem to have convinced Justin rather quickly. So how exactly did you guys meet?" Justin opened his mouth to answer, but Ava placed her free hand on his arm. She could tell Kevin was looking for any way to tear their story apart, and she feared Justin would leave the romance out when he told it, leaving the door open for more questions. "On the beach. Is there any place more romantic?" She smiled out at the audience, earning some cheers. "I had booked a cottage to work on my next book, and somehow they double-booked Justin in the same cottage. We met on the beach as the sun was setting on the ocean and realized we had an attraction. The rest, as they say, is history." This time, when she smiled out at the audience, she earned a chorus of ahs. Justin smiled as he watched Ava spin their meeting. If she wrote anything like she told a story, then her books must be amazing. He was drawn in, and he knew it was false. Justin sneaked a glance at Kevin, but he too was mesmerized by Ava. "I have to admit, it does sound like a good story, but we've received an anonymous tip that it's just that, a story. So what do you say to that?" Justin's jaw clenched as the audience gasped and turned accusing eyes their direction. He'd been wrong to dismiss Tia. She was evidently more vindictive than he'd first thought. "I'd say you should vet your sources better, Kevin. And the timing is quite interesting. You just got back from Maui a few weeks ago, and your trip to the ocean seemed to coincide with your tainted image." "You're right. My partner Peter and I thought I could use a break to recenter and remember why we started the show. He sent me to the cottage because he'd had a good experience there years before. He said magic happens there. I thought he was talking about my outlook." He turned and smiled at Ava, "but it turns out more than one kind of magic happens there." That earned a chorus of ahs from the audience, and Justin knew he had turned the tide. Kevin wouldn't press anymore during this interview for fear of the crowd turning on him. "Well, that definitely sounds sweet and goes to show that love can happen at any time. So, Ava, what's your next book going to be about? A flush crawled across Ava's cheeks and her gaze shifted to the floor. It's about a man who's given up on romance, but meets his opposite and finds love again? Kevin chuckled. Write what you know, am I right? Justin stared at Ava. He'd had no idea he was the topic of her new book, and curiosity coursed through him. How would she portray him? Would it be flattering? He supposed he better read it before he let her put it out there for the world to read. It does make it easier, but it's never all true. I take things that inspire me, and then I put my own spin on them. Well, I'm sure we'll all look forward to reading it. And how about you, Justin? Do you have plans to continue with Who Wants to Marry a Cowboy, now that you've found love again? The question seemed innocent, but there was a gleam in Kevin's eyes that Justin didn't like. He would have to make sure he and Ava were seamless from here on out, because he certainly wasn't sure they had convinced Kevin. I'm not sure what the future holds for me yet, Kevin, but Who Wants to Marry a Cowboy has been my home, and it's always good to go home. And they're lucky to have you. Let's have another round of applause for Justin and Ava and true love. Though the crowd cheered and Ava smiled, Justin's insides churned. That had been close, and he knew Kevin suspected their relationship was fake. The only question was if Kevin cared enough to pursue it. Justin wasn't a huge star, so Kevin might let it go. But then there was Tia. She'd gotten to Kevin quickly. Had she known of their appearance on the show, or had she just shot off her knowledge to anyone who would listen? Well, that was interesting, Ava said as they left the studio. Interesting. Not the word he would have chosen to describe it. Disastrous was a little closer. He thought they'd managed to salvage it, but how well would be determined by the spin in the papers tomorrow. It was not as good as I'd hoped, but you did great. You are quite the storyteller. But I was watching Kevin, and I don't think he bought it entirely. Plus, I'm fairly certain Tia was his source. We just have to be careful. Make sure every T is crossed and every I is... The ringing of his cell phone interrupted his statement. Hang on. Surprise and dread filled Justin as he recognized Elizabeth's number on the screen. He frowned but punched the button. Hello? Justin, it's Liz. Hear me out before you say no. Garrett called me this morning and he's sick. Justin scoffed. Yeah, I've known that for years. No, I mean health-wise. His leukemia has gotten worse and he needs a bone marrow transplant. Justin was already shaking his head. Liz, no, you can't ask me to do that. Hasn't he taken enough from me? He's tried to apologize to you for over a year, Justin, but you haven't let him. And I'm not about to start now. Listen, I'm sorry he's sick, but he needs to look elsewhere. Justin hung up the phone without saying goodbye, but he'd forgotten Ava was right there. She fixed a questioning gaze on him. Is everything okay? Yeah, that was my sister. My half-brother is sick and needs a bone marrow transplant. She wants me to get tested. But you don't want to? Her words were slow and hesitant, as if she didn't understand his unwillingness. And why would she? He hadn't even told her about his half-brother, much less the whole story. Justin sighed and ran a hand across his chin. My brother is a plastic surgeon. He let the words sit there, knowing they would make sense to her in a minute, at least if she had been paying attention. I don't understand, she said with a shake of her head. Specifically, a Botox doctor. Her brow furrowed for a moment as she looked at him, and then her eyes widened. He knew the light switch had been flipped. Not the same Botox doctor that stole your second wife? The very one. How's that for irony? Ava placed a hand on his arm and turned a soft gaze on him. Maybe he's changed. We all make mistakes. Justin shook her hand off. Not Garrett. He's always been like this. We haven't spoken in years, and I'm not about to give him anything, much less bone marrow from my body. But he's your brother. Half-brother. And he was, but he isn't anymore. Justin felt the anger boiling up. He'd tried so hard to not think about Garrett and Candy, and Liz had destroyed it all in one night with her phone call. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath to calm the fire within. This wasn't Ava's fault, and he shouldn't take it out on her. "Come on, I'll take you home,"